They say love finds you when you least expect it, and at the age of 29, I had nearly given up on it. While all the girls I'd grown up with were busy raising toddlers and baking casseroles for church potlucks, I was still working long hours. As a nurse and coming home to a quiet apartment and frozen dinners, I wasn't bitter. Just tired. Tired of first dates that went nowhere, of conversations that led to nothing, of men who treated love like a transaction rather than a bond. But then I met Daniel. He came into my life like a calm wind before a storm, soft, soothing, and just unusual enough to catch my attention. I remember the first time I saw him. He walked into the diner where I used to have breakfast after my night shift. He looked out of place, like someone who didn't belong to any specific era. Classic, clean-shaven, wearing a pressed shirt and dark slacks. He had kind eyes, the kind that made you feel seen and safe. We locked eyes briefly, and I smiled politely. He smiled back. It wasn't long before we started talking. He introduced himself simply. "Hi, I'm Daniel. Do you mind if I sit?" I didn't. And from that day forward, he became my morning routine. Our conversations were slow and deep about books, music, life. He never rushed, never made me feel like I had to impress him. He listened. He was gentle. He asked about my dreams, not just my work. Something about him felt sacred, pure, almost holy in a way I couldn't explain. Looking back, maybe I should have noticed that strange serenity, that monk-like peace he carried with him. But I wasn't thinking with suspicion. I was thinking with my heart. Over the next few months, we grew close. Daniel was respectful to a fault. Never crossed a line, never pressured, never even kissed me until I kissed him first. He didn't talk much about his past, and I didn't push. I thought perhaps he had suffered a heartbreak, or lost someone. He mentioned once that he had lived a very structured life, but I assumed it was just a reference to a strict upbringing. I imagined him raised in a quiet, rural town, maybe by stern parents who expected too much from him, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that when I was with him, I felt chosen, cherished, like all the years I had spent wondering if I was too much or not enough had led me to him. When he proposed, it wasn't dramatic or flashy. He took me back to that diner where we'd met, and over a piece of cherry pie, he looked me in the eye and said, "I want to be yours. If you'll have me." I cried. I laughed. I said yes. My friends were thrilled. My mother, though skeptical of how little we knew about Daniel's background, welcomed him kindly. She said he had an old soul. And I agreed. But in hindsight, I wonder how many of those kind words were really warnings I didn't want to hear. There were signs, of course. He didn't like taking photos. He avoided social events where people might ask too many questions. He was always vague about where he went when he was away. But love is trusting. And I trusted him. We got married in a simple backyard ceremony. Just a few close friends, string lights, and the sound of crickets in the background. He cried during the vows. So did I. I remember thinking that night as I lay beside him, this is it. I've finally found peace. But peace built on secrets is a fragile thing. And though I didn't know it then, the man I had just vowed to love forever was already married to the church. Looking back now, the signs were there. Not big flashing red lights, no. Daniel was too careful for that. His secrets were like shadows at dusk, faint, creeping, easy to overlook if you were basking in the glow of new love. And I was completely and beautifully lost in him. But the truth was never far behind. Even before our wedding, there were things that didn't add up. The first time I noticed it was when we were planning to meet his family. I had asked him about them several times, his parents, siblings, childhood, and he always smiled and said something vague like, "It's complicated," or "We're not very close." That wasn't so unusual, I told myself. Some people don't have warm families. Maybe his upbringing had been difficult, so I let it go. When I offered to go with him to visit his hometown, he dodged the idea gently, saying, "There's really nothing to see. It's a very quiet place. You'd be bored." He never even told me the name of the town, just up north. That's all. Then there was his job, or the lack of one. Daniel never really said what he did for work. He told me he was between positions or doing private consulting, and that most of his money came from past investments. He always had just enough to cover what we needed. He wasn't flashy, but he wasn't broke either. At the time, I thought it was refreshing. A man who wasn't defined by money or title? That was rare. Noble, even. But now, I see it differently. That vagueness was intentional. It wasn't humility, it was evasion, and then there were the nights he disappeared. They didn't happen often, but they were always the same. He would receive a call, get quiet, and tell me he needed to help someone or handle a personal matter. He wouldn't return until morning. Once, he came home smelling like incense and wood polish. I asked him about it. He said he'd been visiting an old friend who ran an antique shop. I believed him. I always believed him, because he said everything so calmly, so gently, like the truth had already been settled and wasn't mine to question. And perhaps the biggest warning of all came one evening when we were watching television. There was a movie playing, a drama about a priest who had fallen in love. I remember glancing at Daniel, curious what he thought. But he was frozen, tense, his jaw clenched. He looked away from the screen like it offended him. "Turn it off," he said suddenly. I did, but that night, I couldn't sleep. He apologized the next morning, blamed it on a bad memory, and then kissed my forehead. "There are things in my past I'm not proud of," he said softly, "but I'm trying to leave them behind." Still, I didn't ask for more. I didn't want to shatter what we had with questions. I had always believed that love meant accepting someone's past without demanding the details. But now, I know better. Now I know that secrets left in the dark only grow heavier in silence. He also never wanted to take pictures, not even on our wedding day. We had a few snapshots that friends took, but he said he didn't like cameras. Said he was a private man. Even our honeymoon was oddly short, just a few days at a quiet cabin, no flights, no crowds. He never met many of my friends, either. He avoided gatherings and said he didn't do well in large, secular environments. At the time, I admired that. I thought it was a sign of spiritual depth, of a man who valued solitude over socializing. But it wasn't solitude he was protecting. It was a secret identity. One time, I saw him kneeling in the living room late at night, whispering in Latin. I asked him about it, half joking that he looked like a priest. His face went pale. He laughed nervously. "Just something from school. I studied classical languages for a while," he said. Another lie. Another brushstroke on the canvas of deception. And yet, I brushed it aside. Again and again, because when you love someone, you want so badly to believe that what they say is real. You wrap their words around you like a blanket and ignore the chill in the air. But the truth was there, breathing down our necks even in the quiet moments. I didn't know it yet, but I was sharing my life, my heart, and my home with a man who had already vowed himself to something else. Something sacred. A man who had already said I do, not to me, but to the church. Every woman dreams about her wedding day, even if she says she doesn't. Deep down, there's always a vision, a quiet hope, of how it will feel to look into the eyes of someone who promises to love you forever. And for me, that dream had been simmering for years, waiting for the right man. I thought Daniel was that man. The morning of our wedding was beautiful, not extravagant, not dramatic, just beautiful in its simplicity. The ceremony was set in my cousin's backyard, with string lights hanging from trees and white folding chairs lined up along the grass. We didn't have a big guest list. Daniel said he didn't want a spectacle, just something small and meaningful. I agreed. I wasn't the kind of woman who needed lace tablecloths or 100 guests. All I wanted was love. But there was something odd in the air that day, a silence that didn't quite feel peaceful. Daniel had insisted we not have a priest officiate. He said he had issues with the church and wanted a friend to perform the ceremony. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. I'd known plenty of couples who opted for civil ceremonies or symbolic ones, but now, I can't help but wonder. What was he afraid of? Who was he hiding from? When I walked down that makeshift aisle, my heart was pounding, but not in the way I expected. There was excitement, of course, but also an undercurrent of anxiety I couldn't place. Daniel looked almost too composed, standing there with his hands folded, not smiling like most grooms do. Just watching me, quietly, like he was saying goodbye to something. The ceremony was quick. Too quick, in hindsight. The vows were standard, and when it came time to kiss, he hesitated for half a second. Just long enough for it to register, just long enough to bruise something inside me that I didn't even know could be bruised. Afterward, we celebrated with lemonade and finger foods. No champagne, no loud music. He said he didn't drink and didn't like crowds. Everyone respected his wishes, of course. They said he was gentle and deep and refreshing, compared to loud modern men. But something about that day felt staged. As if he were playing a part. Saying all the right lines but never fully present in the scene. His eyes would sometimes drift to the trees or the sky, like he was praying silently or begging for something I couldn't understand. When it was time to cut the cake, he let me do it alone. He said he didn't like sweets. He said a lot of things that day that didn't feel quite right. But I was so eager to be a wife, so desperate to believe I had finally been chosen, that I ignored the knots in my stomach. I smiled through them. I told myself this was just who he was: calm, reserved, mysterious. And maybe, I thought, loving someone means accepting all of their shadows too. That night, after all the guests had left and the lights were turned off, I sat beside him on the edge of our bed. I told him how happy I was. He nodded, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "Thank you for accepting me." I didn't understand the weight of those words at the time, but now, they haunt me. He wasn't thanking me for marrying him. He was thanking me for believing the version of him that wasn't real, for not asking too many questions, for going along with the illusion. Even on our wedding night, he didn't touch me. He said he was tired, that he wanted to pray and reflect. He kissed my hand and said, "Tomorrow, we begin a new journey." That was it. I laid awake most of the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that this was romantic, that this was meaningful, that maybe we were just different. But something inside me knew better. A woman can feel when something isn't right. Even when she's wrapped in satin sheets and surrounded by fresh flowers, it felt like I had married a ghost. Someone present, in form, but not in spirit. And still, I held on to hope. Because I was a wife now, because I had said, "I do." Because if I let myself believe, even for a second, that our wedding wasn't real, then everything I had dreamed of would come crashing down. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those lazy, golden days where nothing seems urgent and time moves slowly. Daniel had left early that morning, saying he needed to meet an old friend from his past. I didn't ask for details. By that point, I was used to his vague explanations. But something inside me had shifted since the wedding. I had started noticing things, or rather, I had stopped ignoring them. I began paying attention to the way he flinched when we passed churches, the way he changed the subject when I brought up children, or starting a family, the way he'd go silent during prayer. So when I saw his car parked outside the stone church on Oakwood Avenue, I was surprised and truthfully confused. It wasn't just any church. It was an old Catholic church, the kind with stained glass windows and towering crosses, the kind that carried a deep, reverent silence even from the outside. I hadn't followed him there, not intentionally. I'd gone out to buy groceries and happened to pass by. But there was no denying the silver of his car, parked neatly near the rectory. I felt my stomach twist. I parked across the street and waited. Maybe he was just visiting someone. Maybe he liked to pray privately. Maybe, this was all still explainable. But then I saw him. He walked out of the side entrance, talking to another man in a long black robe. They laughed, and then Daniel, my husband, reached into his bag and pulled out something that nearly made my knees give way. A clerical collar, that thin white strip tucked neatly into the black band at his neck. The symbol I had seen on priests since I was a girl. The symbol that had always represented humility, discipline, and commitment to God. He put it on like muscle memory, effortless, natural, familiar. He didn't even hesitate. He wore it like he'd worn it 1,000 times before. Because he had, I sat frozen in the driver's seat, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. My first instinct was to assume there was a mistake, that this was part of some role, a favor for a friend, a costume for a service. But deep down, I knew. I knew by the way he carried himself. I knew by the way the others greeted him, not like a guest, but like a brother. I knew by the reverence in their eyes. Daniel wasn't visiting. He belonged there. He was one of them, a priest. I waited until he went back inside before I drove home. My hands shook on the steering wheel the whole way. My groceries were still in the trunk, but I left them there. I walked straight into the bedroom, sat on the floor, and cried. How could this be possible? How could the man I had married, the man who held me in his arms and whispered promises of forever, be bound to someone else? I pulled out our marriage license, stared at it. It looked legal, real, but suddenly, I questioned everything. Was it valid? Was he even allowed to marry me? Had he lied to me? Or to the church? I didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal, or the feeling that I had never really known him at all. When he returned home that night, he looked calm, serene even. He kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day had been. I didn't confront him. Not then. I couldn't. I needed time to process, to breathe, to hold on to what little pieces of reality still made sense. I went to bed early that night, pretending to be tired. I turned my back to him in bed, my mind a whirlpool of questions, regrets, and heartbreak. And as I stared into the darkness, one thought echoed louder than the rest. I married a man who had already married God. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? My mind was drowning in thoughts, memories, fears. Every word Daniel had ever said to me now felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. The loving husband I had once admired now felt like a stranger, wearing his skin, and that collar. That one white strip of truth, visible for just a moment, had shattered the illusion I'd been living in. The next morning, I made coffee as usual. My hands trembled as I stirred the sugar into my cup. Daniel came in humming a soft hymn, a hymn I now recognized from Catholic Mass. That sound, once comforting, now sent chills down my spine. He sat down at the table across from me like it was any normal day. He looked at me and smiled. And I looked him straight in the eyes and asked, "Are you a priest?" Just like that. No build-up, no hesitation. I couldn't pretend anymore. His smile faltered. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. His eyes widened slightly, but he didn't act surprised. He didn't lie. He didn't even try. He simply lowered his gaze, took a deep breath, and said, "I was?" That one word was carried so much weight. I wanted to believe it was true, that he had left the priesthood before we met, that our love hadn't been a sin or a scandal, that I hadn't been the other woman in some sacred vow. But I knew better. When I asked, barely able to speak, he didn't answer right away. He rubbed his forehead and looked away. "Officially," he said, "I never left. Not in the church's eyes." I felt the world spin. "You mean, when we got married, you were still?" "Yes." The room went silent again. My heart thundered in my chest. I felt hot, then cold, then hollow. "You lied to me," I whispered. "I didn't lie," he said quietly. "I just didn't tell you everything." I laughed bitterly. "That's the definition of lying, Daniel." He reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you do this to me?" He looked pained. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he truly loved me, that our connection was the most real thing he had ever felt. "But you knew," I snapped. "You knew what you were sworn to. You took vows. You told God you would never marry." "I thought I could have both," he said, tears brimming in his eyes. "I thought maybe love was stronger. But it wasn't," I said, standing up from the table. "Because you couldn't even be honest with me." He broke then. He cried. Not loud sobs, just silent, painful tears that ran down his face as he sat there in his robe, looking more like a fallen angel than a husband. "I tried to leave," he said. "I really did. I even wrote the letter to the diocese, but I never sent it. I didn't know how. I was afraid." I paced the kitchen, trying to breathe, trying not to fall apart. "So what are we?" I asked. "Am I your wife? Am I just your mistress in the eyes of the church? Was our wedding even real?" He couldn't answer, because the answer was too cruel. I was nothing, not in the church's eyes, not in the law of his God. Our vows were empty, our love a sin. The foundation of my life, the man I'd trusted, the future I'd envisioned, had been built on sand, and it was collapsing all around me. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just walked into the bedroom, closed the door, and cried until I couldn't feel my face. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I couldn't. He slept on the couch. The next day, I packed a bag and left. I stayed with my sister for a week, too ashamed to tell her why. I couldn't find the words. I didn't know how to explain the kind of betrayal that doesn't leave bruises but cuts you so deeply you bleed inside. And yet, I still loved him. That was the cruelest part of all. I loved a man who never should have been mine, a man who chose me and chose to lie to me, all at once. The truth had come crashing down, and it had buried the woman I was. When I left Daniel that morning, I told myself I just needed space, a few days to think, to breathe, to process what I had learned. But as the hours stretched into days, and the silence between us grew louder, I realized something heartbreaking. I wasn't just processing a lie. I was mourning a life that never existed. At my sister's house, I didn't sleep. I didn't eat much. I stared at the ceiling most nights, wondering how I had been so blind. I played back every moment, every word, every quiet smile he gave me that now felt like a mask. I kept waiting for him to show up, but he didn't, not on the first night. Not on the second. By the third day, my sister finally asked, "What's going on between you two?" And all I could say was, "I don't think I know the man I married." On the sixth day, I went back. Not because I had found clarity, but because I couldn't live in limbo anymore. I needed answers. I needed closure. Or maybe I needed one more chance to believe he would beg me to stay, renounce everything. Choose me. When I walked through the front door, he was sitting at the table, reading, like nothing had happened. Like our world hadn't just crumbled to dust. He stood when he saw me, relief flooding his face. "I didn't know if you'd come back," he said softly. "I didn't know either," I replied. We stood there, silence, thick in the space between us. And then I asked, "How long have you been living this double life?" He sat back down slowly, as if the question itself was too heavy to carry, standing up. "Since before I met you," he said. I was already struggling. Torn, struggling. I scoffed. "Daniel, you took vows. Sacred vows. And then you turned around and made more, with me." "I know," he said, pain in his voice. "And I meant them. Both sets." I laughed, bitter and exhausted. "You can't have both, Daniel. You can't be mine and God's. That's not how this works." He didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to spin a new story. Instead, he looked at me with those same calm eyes that had once comforted me, only now they felt hollow. "I thought I could build a new life," he said. "I thought love could rewrite everything. But I was wrong." "No," I said. "You were selfish. You didn't think about me. About what it would do to me when I found out." He nodded slowly. "You're right. That was the hardest part. The fact that he didn't fight, didn't protest, didn't twist things into some clever justification. He just accepted it, like a man who already knew the punishment was coming and believed he deserved it." "I should have told you," he said. "Yes," I replied, eyes burning. "You should have told me before you asked me to marry you. Before you let me fall in love with a fantasy." He swallowed hard. "I didn't want to lose you, and now you have," I said. I don't know what I expected to feel in that moment. Anger, relief, closure. Instead, I just felt empty. I walked through the house, our house, and saw it differently for the first time. The photos that weren't taken. The religious books he kept hidden in a drawer. The quiet hours he spent alone. I saw it all now. The clues I had ignored because love had made me blind. He followed me into the bedroom. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. I turned and looked at him. Really looked at him. "I don't know," I said. "But I can't be your secret anymore?" He nodded again, like a man who had already had this conversation with himself 1,000 times. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said. "And yet you did," I whispered. I left again that night, this time without looking back. I didn't need more time. I didn't need more apologies. I needed freedom. I needed truth. I needed to start mourning what I had lost. Not just the marriage, but the future I thought I had. The life I had dreamed of. The man I thought I knew, and for the first time, in a long time, I cried not because of what he did, but because of what I let myself believe. There's something soul-crushing about realizing your life has been built on a foundation of illusions. That your memories, even the happiest ones, were stage scenes in someone else's script. That your vows, your promises, your sacred moments were not recognized by the very man you shared them with. It took weeks before I was ready to look at our marriage certificate again. It had been tucked in a drawer under old photographs and documents, a page I once held with pride, now crinkled and trembling in my hands. I stared at it as if willing it to tell me the truth. Was this paper binding? Was I, in the eyes of the law and the world, Daniel's wife? But more haunting than any legal doubt was the deeper question that circled in my heart. Was I ever his partner and soul, or just a chapter in his double life? I made some calls to a lawyer, then quietly, anonymously, to a local priest I had known for years. I didn't give names. I just asked questions. Can a Catholic priest get married without being excommunicated? The priest on the line grew quiet. Then, softly, he answered, "No. Unless they've formally left the clergy, marriage is forbidden. It's considered invalid in the eyes of the church." I thanked him and hung up. That word echoed in my mind. Invalid. Was that what I was? Was everything we had shared? The kisses, the prayers, the plans for a future invalid? I felt like I was dissolving. Not just heartbroken, but erased. Like I had been cast in a play that was never meant to be seen. I spent days trying to piece it all together. I remembered the way Daniel had insisted we keep the ceremony small. The lack of photos. His refusal to involve a priest or any religious element. At the time, I thought it was modesty. Now I saw it for what it was. Evasion. He hadn't wanted a wedding, he'd needed a performance, and I had been the unwitting co-star in a tragic farce. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was the shame. The shame of not knowing. The shame of having introduced myself as a wife when I legally might not have been. The shame of believing so deeply in someone who never had the courage to come clean. Daniel never lied with his words. He lied with his omissions, and those are the most dangerous kinds of lies. The ones you can't prove. The ones that leave you questioning your own instincts, your own sanity. I found myself thinking, what kind of man wears a collar on Sunday and a wedding ring on Monday? One committed to deception. But here's what tore at me most. I still loved him, or at least, the man I thought he was. I remembered the mornings he made me tea. The quiet way he would brush my hair back when I was reading. The way he would close his eyes during thunderstorms and whisper, "Peace is in the silence." Was that love, or just another mask? I tried to find solace in logic. I looked up the canon laws of the Catholic Church. I read articles and forums. I tried to convince myself that Daniel had been confused. That maybe he wanted out, but didn't know how. That perhaps I wasn't a victim, just a casualty of a deeply conflicted man. But no matter how I spun it, the truth was undeniable. He made a vow to God, and then he made one to me, knowing they couldn't coexist. That's not confusion. That's betrayal. I went back to our house one last time to gather my things. The air inside felt still, like time had frozen. His books, his quiet sandals by the door. The smell of incense faint in the curtains. I walked into our bedroom and stared at the bed where we had once whispered dreams. I reached under the mattress and pulled out the small wooden box I had once seen him hide. Inside were rosary beads, a gold crucifix, and a letter dated nearly 2 years before we met, addressed to a bishop. It was a draft of a resignation from the priesthood, but it had never been sent. He had written it, considered it, dreamed of it, but in the end, he couldn't do it. He had kept the letter like a talisman, proof to himself that he could walk away, even if he never would. I left the box on his nightstand. I didn't need to read another word. I walked out of that house with tears in my eyes and a suitcase in my hand. I didn't slam the door. I didn't scream. I didn't burn anything in anger, because what had died wasn't the marriage, it was the illusion, and the only way to survive that kind of death is to be reborn. I was raised in a house where faith wasn't just something we practiced on Sundays, it was something we breathed. My mother prayed over our food, over our wounds, over the sky when it thundered. My grandmother kept a cross on her wall and a Bible beside her pillow. And me. I grew up believing that God was always watching, always guiding, always placing people in our lives for a reason. So when I met Daniel, and he spoke gently about grace, and forgiveness and peace, I thought, God must have sent him to me. What a cruel illusion that turned out to be. After I left, I didn't set foot in a church for nearly a year. Every time I passed one, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I couldn't even hear a hymn without feeling betrayed. My faith, once my refuge, had become a source of pain. How do you pray when the person who broke you wore the robes of holiness? How do you trust God when the man who whispered sermons in secret also whispered lies into your ears at night? I wasn't just heartbroken. I was spiritually fractured. Daniel hadn't just betrayed me as a husband, he had defiled something sacred. He took the image of a servant of God and used it to mask his own desires, his own cowardice. And in doing so, he made me question the very faith that had always anchored me. I started asking questions I never imagined I would ask. Was God real? Was this his plan for me? Had he turned his face from me the day I said I do to a man who never should have been mine? I couldn't pray. I couldn't read scripture. I felt like a fraud walking into any religious space. Even more than that, I felt abandoned. I had done everything right. I waited for love. I trusted. I opened my heart. I built a home. I honored my vows. And still, I ended up alone, lied to, and left with nothing but a shattered dream. One night, I found myself driving with no destination, crying so hard I could barely see the road. I pulled over at an empty gas station, leaned my head against the steering wheel, and screamed into the silence. Why would you let this happen to me? No answer came. Just silence. But that silence, strangely enough, held something new. It wasn't peace. Not yet. It wasn't comfort. But it was a beginning, because, in that silence, I realized I was still here, still breathing, still hurting, still asking, and that meant I hadn't completely lost my faith, only my illusion of it. I had believed that faith was a contract: do good, get good, follow the rules, and God will protect you from pain. But now I understood something much harder. Faith isn't protection. It's perseverance. It's choosing to believe in love even after betrayal. It's choosing to believe in light even after being buried in darkness. It's choosing to believe in God, even when you're angry at Him. I began slowly, painfully, reconnecting with the pieces of my spirituality that hadn't been tainted by Daniel. I started walking again, watching the sunrise, sitting in nature, listening to the birds and remembering that the world still held beauty, even if my life felt broken. I lit candles, not in a church, but in my own home, quietly, alone, whispering little prayers into the flickering light, prayers that sounded more like sobs than sentences, and slowly, I began to heal, not all at once, not in a grand revelation, but one breath at a time, one truth at a time. I began to separate Daniel from God. One was a man flawed, afraid, and ultimately selfish. The other, still mysterious, still far away, but perhaps not absent. It wasn't easy, and even now, years later, I still flinch when someone speaks of divine love too casually. I still carry scars where hope once lived, but I also carry strength, because I survived a spiritual betrayal that could have destroyed me. I didn't walk away from God. I walked toward Him slowly, painfully, and with my fists clenched, but I walked anyway, because if I gave up on faith entirely, then Daniel would have stolen more than my love. He would have stolen my soul. And I refused to let that happen. After months of silence, I gathered the courage to write a letter, a real one, with inked tears and a trembling heart. I addressed it to the diocese where Daniel had once served, or perhaps still did. I didn't know the full truth, but I knew enough to ask questions. I knew I had lived with a man who was a priest in secret. I knew I had married him while he was still bound to the church, and I knew I deserved answers. I wasn't angry when I wrote that first letter. Not yet. I was broken, confused, humble. I signed it not as a whistleblower, not as a vengeful ex-wife, but as a woman seeking the truth. Weeks passed, no response. I sent another letter. This time, I added details, names, dates, copies of our marriage license. A copy of the draft letter I had found under his mattress, the one he had never sent, confessing his intent to leave the priesthood. This time, they replied, a single envelope, thin, cold. Thank you for your concern. We are aware of the situation and will take it under advisement. Please understand that we cannot comment on internal matters. That was it. No apology, no follow-up, no effort to contact me directly or hear what I had endured. It was like I had sent my pain into a vacuum. I thought, surely, this must be a mistake. Maybe I reached the wrong office. Maybe I needed to speak to someone higher up. So I called. I left messages. I asked to speak to a representative. I even drove 2 hours to the Chancery building and requested a meeting in person. They told me no one was available. I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands clenched around the steering wheel, watching young priests walk by in their black collars. Some looked younger than Daniel. Some were probably pure-hearted and sincere, but I couldn't see them that way anymore. To me, they all wore the same mask, the one Daniel had worn when he made me breakfast and kissed my forehead while hiding his sacred vows like skeletons in a closet. I tried one last time. I emailed the bishop directly. I wrote plainly, honestly. I told him that I had loved a priest, that I had unknowingly married a man bound by the church, that I had been misled, betrayed, and left in emotional ruin. I begged him to acknowledge my story, but no answer came. And that's when the shame turned into anger. Because the church that taught me about truth wanted mine to disappear? The church that said God sees the broken refused to look at me. The church that preaches forgiveness wouldn't even say my name. I wasn't just betrayed by Daniel. I was betrayed by the institution that allowed him to live this double life, either through ignorance or indifference. What would have happened if I had never spoken up? Would he have continued living in both worlds? Serving God on Sundays and kissing me goodnight on Mondays? The truth is, I don't know if they really didn't know, or simply didn't want to. Because sometimes institutions are less interested in righteousness than they are in preservation, and women like me, inconvenient truths are easier to ignore than to confront. I realized something else. Too, I wasn't the only one. I began reading, researching. I found stories from other women. Women who had been involved with priests, some knowingly, some not. Women who had been silenced. Women who had carried their grief in secret. Some had children. Others had nothing left but scars. It opened my eyes. This wasn't just about me. It was about a pattern, a system, a silence that protects the cloth while burying the wounded. And yet, in all that pain, I found something unexpected. Solidarity. I started writing, not just letters but journals. Pages and pages of truth. I began telling my story. First in small support groups, and then publicly, if the church wouldn't listen. Maybe someone else would. Maybe another woman, sitting in her living room with a broken heart, would hear my voice and feel less alone. Maybe that was the purpose of my suffering, not to be silenced, but to be a warning. Because, if a man can hide behind the name of God and live two lives, someone has to lift the curtain. And if the church won't do it, I will. Asterisk after everything, the lies, the silence, the abandonment, I was left with the question every betrayed woman eventually faces: what now? I had no husband, no answers, and no faith in the institution I once trusted. I felt like a house after a storm, still standing, maybe, but unlivable. There was no blueprint for rebuilding a life that never should have existed in the first place. No checklist for healing from a love built on a contradiction. But one morning, as I sat in my sister's guest room, staring at a half-packed suitcase and wondering if I'd ever be able to move forward, I whispered something to myself: start small. So I did. The first thing I did was take a walk. Just a short one, around the neighborhood. No headphones, no phone, just my feet on the ground and my breath in the cold air. It didn't solve anything. But for 15 minutes, I was just a woman, moving forward. Not a victim, not a broken wife, just someone. Still walking next. I cleaned out my things. I opened the boxes I had shoved aside, filled with trinkets from a marriage that wasn't real. Photos, wedding programs, a journal I had once kept full of sweet little notes Daniel had written me. I burned them. Not out of hate, but out of love for myself. I needed to let go of the dream I had clung to for so long. It hurt. God, it hurt. Watching the flames curl around those memories was like watching part of me disappear. But I had to clear space, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to let anything new grow. After that, I got to work. I found a job. Nothing glamorous, just a receptionist at a small accounting firm. I hadn't worked in years. I was rusty, nervous, but showing up every day, answering phones, filing papers, it gave me something I hadn't had in months. Purpose. I made new routines. I started cooking again. For me this time, I would light a candle on my kitchen table, put on old jazz records, and sit with myself like I was someone worth feeding. I reconnected with old friends, the ones Daniel had said were too worldly, the ones he had subtly discouraged me from seeing. I reached out, admitted my shame, and was shocked at the love I received. You were fooled, one friend said, but you're not a fool. I joined a book club. I started therapy. I adopted a cat named Juniper. And little by little, brick by brick, I rebuilt. But healing isn't a straight line. There were nights I cried myself to sleep. Nights when I'd smell his cologne in an old coat and break down on the floor. Days I would see a couple holding hands in the park and feel a sharp stab of envy. Sundays were the worst. The echoes of hymns, the memory of sitting beside him in silence, haunted me like shadows. But I didn't give up. Because here's what I learned. Heartbreak isn't the end of your story, it's a chapter. A painful, pivotal chapter that reveals who you are when everything else falls away. And I discovered something powerful. I am resilient. I am more than the woman who loved a man who lied. I am more than the silence the church tried to bury. I am more than the victim of a stolen life. I am a survivor of sacred betrayal. And I chose to rise. I started speaking out. Quietly. At first. In support groups. On small podcasts. Eventually, I was invited to write a column in a women's magazine about spiritual recovery. The responses were overwhelming. Women, so many women wrote back. I thought I was alone. Your story is mine. Thank you for saying what I couldn't. And that's when I realized, maybe this is what my pain was for. Not punishment, but purpose. I don't pretend to have all the answers now. I still carry scars. I still flinch when someone asks too many questions about my past. But I no longer carry shame. Because the shame doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the man who chose to lie. To the institution that chose to protect him. To the silence that almost swallowed me whole. But I lived, and I rebuilt, and I am still here. If you're listening to this, and your heart feels heavy, and your soul feels like it's splintering under the weight of betrayal, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not alone. I was you. I was the woman who believed too deeply. The one who looked into a man's eyes and saw forever, only to find out he had never intended to give it. I was the woman who sat in the dark asking, was I not enough? I was the one who blamed herself for someone else's sin, so hear me now. From the voice of someone who lived through it, it wasn't your fault. If he lied to you, that's on him. If he made you believe he was someone he wasn't, that's on him. If he twisted your faith, your love, your trust, that's on him. Your worth was never tied to his truth. And your healing doesn't depend on his apology. Maybe, like me, you loved someone who wore the collar of a priest, or the smile of a good man, or the mask of faith. Maybe he used words like God's will, or our destiny to cover his secrets. Maybe he convinced you that your love was stronger than the rules, more powerful than the vows he made before you ever walked into his life. And maybe you believed him. I did too. And when the truth broke free like a crack in stained glass, it didn't just shatter the image I had of him, it shattered the image I had of myself. I wondered how I could have missed the signs. I wondered if I had been desperate, naive, foolish. I questioned every decision, every smile. Every night I spent by his side thinking we were building something sacred, but here's what I've learned. And what I need you to know: a loving heart is never a weakness. Trusting someone isn't a flaw. Believing in love isn't a mistake. You gave your best. That is never shameful. The shame belongs to those who betray love, who twist sacred words into manipulation, who wear the name of God but ignore his most basic commands: honesty, compassion, truth. If you're grieving now, grieving a man who lied, grieving a future that never truly existed, let yourself grieve, cry, scream. Write letters you'll never send. But don't stay there forever. Because on the other side of grief is rebirth. You are not the same woman who said I do under false pretenses. You are not the same woman who sat in that kitchen chair and heard the truth fall from his lips like a confession, too late. You are stronger now, wiser, sharper, braver. You have lived through the kind of betrayal that could crush a spirit, and you are still here, and if you're still standing, that means you can walk, and if you can walk, you can rise. Start small. Go outside. Make your bed, write your story. Say your truth out loud, even if your voice shakes, especially if it shakes. Because when you speak, you give other women permission to speak too. That's how we heal. Together. And to those who still carry the burden silently, who still sit across the dinner table from a man they're afraid to question, who still kneel in a pew beside a priest who they suspect is not who he says he is. You deserve the truth. Not just because of what he did, but because of who you are. You are a daughter of strength. You are a keeper of sacred love. And your story matters, so don't let them bury it. Don't let the silence win. Whether you whisper it to yourself, scream it from a rooftop, or share it with the world, like I'm doing now, tell your story. Not to ruin him, not to shame the church, but to reclaim your voice, because it was never his to take. If my story touched your heart, or if you know someone who needs to hear these words, please share this video. Let's make sure no woman ever feels invisible again. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories like mine, and if you've lived something similar, leave a comment. I'll be reading. I promise you're not alone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing me. And most of all, thank you for surviving.